So
I'm the only one talking for the whole hour, but I would just maybe give some brief reflections on what I remember about Korean tradition.
Japanese, what you observed in Japan.
Yeah, Japan I have much lesser experience. I just stayed there for 6 months, but in Korea I lived for something like 18 years or something.
දැන් අද අපි මේ දැන් අපි දිගටම බුද්ධ ධර්ම ගැන කතා කරගෙන ආවේ බුද්දිසම් ගැන. ඉතින් අද අපි බෝධි ආමුදුරෝ කොරියාවේ බුද්ධ ධර්ම ගැන අපිට විස්තරයක් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නයි යන්නේ.
I think she speaks English very well, so no need to translate.
Yes. Yes.
So the others also, no? People watch.
Oh, yeah, there is a recording. I forgot about that. For some people who don't maybe know.
If Vinita is comfortable, you can do it. If you are not comfortable to translate it, because you said you are a bit...
Is it on now?
Yes.
Okay. No, I was thinking when he talks I can go and walk. And if you need to translate, I will come and translate.
Yeah, if you feel like that, no problem.
Yes. Okay. Right. And Bodhi Andro, you are welcome to tell us something about Buddhism in Korea.
Yeah. Maybe I should be there, so...
So if you come there, it is better.
Basically, it's a Mahayana tradition with some elements of what they call Vajrayana. It's some form of Vajrayana that they don't have in Tibet, but something that Korea inherited from China. And of course, the whole process of Buddhism moving eastward was through Tibet and through China first, in the maybe 1st century of the Common Era. Buddhism arrived there, and then it took maybe, they say, about 300 years until it really became established and until good translations were made, mostly of the Mahayana texts, but also, we were talking yesterday, there is a considerable body of texts that were from Sarvastivada school,
Yes,
I think.
Sarvastivada.
And they are still there, existing in Chinese. And this German monk Anale or Bhikkhu is actually one of the, maybe the first one who tried to compare this text with the Pali. He learned both languages and he wrote some studies about that. And he finds actually more similarities with very few differences between them, especially not really essential differences. So Buddhism came to China, and then from there came to Korea. Then maybe most of you don't know that Korea was not one country at the time. It was Silla, Pekche, and what was the third one? Maybe Chosun or something like that. There were 3 small countries that were on that territory that is today North Korea and South Korea. That's a fairly small territory, but I think in those days the countries tended to be much smaller because it was difficult to control big territory, except in the cases of empires maybe. And the Buddhism came in the 3rd century of the Common Era to Korea. At first, the aristocracy and royal family and so on, they accepted it pretty well, but then through the history it went up and down, just like in Sri Lanka we were talking yesterday, but in many other countries it was not a very smooth process. Things went like monks were accepted and supported, and then there was a period that lasted almost 500 years. They call it Chosun period, during which Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism became very strong, and they were having all the government positions, and they looked at Buddhism as a conservative and not really good for the state. So they chased all the monks out of the capital making some difficulties for monks to ordain and so on, and they reduced the number of monasteries from a few hundred Buddhist monasteries in Korea to, I think, just 36 monasteries at one point. So that was the period of Buddhism where all the monks and monasteries moved to the mountains, which in those days maybe was not very good for them, but it made monasteries more independent. Now, you also have to know that in Mahayana, monks are often allowed, not often, always allowed to have their own property and also to cultivate fields, to even have, you know, like the whole thing. They were pretty much independent of the laity. Laity would support them in some ways, but monks would have their own kitchen and cook in the kitchen and all that. That's like now the big difference that came partially because they didn't care much about Vinaya, but partially because of this historical differences that the monasteries were left not supported by government at one point anymore, and then the monks, if they wanted to survive, they had to take care about their own needs. So what is important for Korean Buddhism is to know that the main school, the main tradition that they cherish until today is Zen school that they call Son Bulgyo, would be Son Zen Buddhism. And then there is a peculiar style of Buddhism because it very much stresses that you don't have to study anything and that you just have to meditate, which of course can be, on one side, can be maybe rewarded in some ways because people focus on practice, but on the danger for that kind of approach is that many monks end up not knowing what they are practicing or what they have to attain or what difficulties in practice they may meet. Of course, there are older monks who are teaching younger monks, and that is very much Confucian tradition. So they would say Buddhism is not learned from the books. You have to learn it from somebody who is, they would use the word master, somebody who practices long time, has some good benefits of that practice. So that was the tradition that they maintained, and they were insisting that from one master, teaching comes to a student who becomes a master in his turn, and then he has to find a good student to transmit the teaching. So I think we again lose what the Buddha was saying, that you actually have to study the Dhamma that he was teaching, and that was not a closed fist, because in Zen tradition definitely there is a closed fist teaching, where they use a method called Kongan in Korean, but it's maybe more known as Koan. These are some kind of questions that are a little tricky to answer, and then they require their students to sit and meditate, and when the mind is clear, to raise that question and to try to come with an answer, and then they go to the teacher, and that's always happening in a completely private situation. Nobody is allowed to be even close so as not to hear what is being exchanged between the teacher and the student. And so that is the way that they transmit their teachings. So that tradition, so-called Zen tradition, is the most vital, has most vitality and most followers even today. I lived in one of the monasteries that is also called, like, it was named the International Zen Monastery. How was it, like Kupche Sonwan Hwagesa was the full name, and it was run by a teacher who spent some time in America, so he was fluent, not fluent, but he could speak some English, and he attracted many people. Then apart from that school that is gathered around Chogye order, which is the strongest body of Buddhist monks that has they have administration and the big headquarters in downtown Seoul. There are, I believe, 18 or 19 maybe now different sects. Again, that number 18, but I think that's just a coincidence. And in Mahayana, because they have these strange scriptures that are sometimes contradicting each other, like we were talking about Lotus Sutra or Flower Ornament Sutra, how they call it, Avatansaka Sutra, and then a few Prajna Paramita Sutras that they called with Transcendent Wisdom Sutras and so on. When they form a sect, they usually say, our main teaching is this. We hold on to Lotus Sutra. Lotus Sutra is better than the other sutras, and so on. So they get into that thing. I would again say that the Buddha was criticizing, like holding certain views and then arguing about them, or just being somehow convinced that only this particular sutra, which are not even the Buddha's words, but of course they would not accept that. They would say these are the Buddha's words. So they hold on to them, and these practices are again quite mysterious and quite not really well explained. You have to go to the teacher and ask questions, and they consist many times in repeating tarani or mantra. That means like Om Mani Padme Hum is in one of these sects that they call Chongak Purgyo. They repeat Om Mani Padme Hum. That sect is influenced by Tantric Buddhism. But then in this Lotus Sutra sect, they have another mantra that they repeat. I think it's Namo Kwanzum Bosal Namo Sokyamuni Bul Chongyo. I forgot now, but the name of a Bodhisattva, the name of Shakyamuni Buddha, and the name of that sutra repeating many times. They believe that just by repeating these things, you develop some strength, you develop good karma, and then out of that comes all the benefits. And then of course, as Bhante was mentioning yesterday, it was all directed towards making bodhisattvas, making people who will accumulate good karma, perfect their paramis, and eventually reach some stage, of course after many lives, reach a stage where they would be able to become Buddhas. Then of course some tradition or Zen tradition is insisting that you don't get there without an insight into the nature of Dharma, the nature of, they would sometimes talk even about self or a true self, which is again different from anatta that Theravada Buddhism is talking. And so they are insisting that you have to meditate a lot and get that insight. One important monk, maybe two important monks in the history of Korean tradition. One was called Pojo Chinul, and he was a monk from aristocratic family who decided to purify Buddhism. So just like in Sri Lanka or in Thailand and other countries, there were always periods where Buddhism declines. Then that monk appears and he says, let's purify Buddhism. And so he made a society he called it Samadhi Prajna Society, Jongye Sa, and that became a monastery that exists even today. That was happening in the 13th century. He established a monastery called Songwangsa, and that monastery is in the southern part of South Korea, and it still exists, and it's still actually quite respected for the discipline and the Zen practice that is done there, and some teachers who live there. And he left behind him some books where he explained his vision of the Dharma. One of his main teaching that he left behind, and that was later commented by many masters, is called sudden breakthrough, gradual cultivation, sudden enlightenment, gradual cultivation. So they would use the word enlightenment actually in a very wide sense, not like attaining complete nibbana. It basically means an insight that is valuable and that changes somebody's life. But then he was saying that insight is not enough. You have to keep gradually cultivating that, kind of building up on that, and then perfecting it until you come to the point that there is nothing more to make perfect, to get higher than that. So that was the teaching that he left behind, and then basically that was almost like a book that nobody dared to criticize. It was maybe comparable, not exactly, but comparable to Visuddhimagga in some ways for Koreans. Of course, Koreans never heard about Visuddhimagga. Koreans generally don't even know about Pali or don't know about Theravada much, except in the recent times a number of Koreans went to Myanmar, to the like Mahasi centers and Pauk Sayadaw centers, and then some of them came back with achieving some good results, both monks and lay people. And from what I know, that nowadays in Korea there are some established Pauk centers and other meditation traditions that are connected with Theravada. In fact, I met one old Korean person who was in Myanmar, and he was even the monk for maybe a year or two. And when I told him that I spent some time in Theravada, he was like so happy, and he said, "This Korean Buddhism is useless. We all have to go back to Theravada. That's the real Buddhism." That's how he. But he's one of a very, very few people in Korea who think that way. Most of the people would. They never seen another form of Buddhism, so they would actually believe that what Korean monks are teaching is all true. So what I started saying is that Poje Chinul and that book about gradual sudden enlightenment, gradual cultivation was unquestionable until in the last century somebody appeared. His name was Songchol Sunim, and they call him, now again that's the word that may surprise you, but they usually call him a living Buddha of Korea. So he was of course not a Buddha, but he was apparently very sincere monk, and they say that after he became, usually in a Korean sompang, which means Zen hall, the place where people come and they meditate in that area, samaneras are not allowed, and lay people can never enter the sompang. But when Songchol, because he was so sincere, when he was just a samanera, they let him meditate in the sompang. They say that's the only case that is known. And for 6 years, he never lied down. He was only meditating in this position, and they say that even during the night, you could not see him nodding or laying down. He would just, I don't know if it's physically possible to spend 6 years in this position day and night, but for him they say that it was possible. So apparently after a lot of hard practice he had some insights, and what he did is interesting. Instead of becoming a preacher, he just went to the mountain and he was just living alone in a mountain called Kayasan in the monastery Heinsa, but somehow apart from other monks. And then people who were interested to talk about Dhamma, they would come to him and he would answer questions, but he would not teach many people. And then he was he had criticism on Poje Chinul. He was saying he was the first one after many centuries to say he was not really enlightened, because if you are really enlightened, you cannot say that there is sudden enlightenment and gradual cultivation. He said there is sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation, whatever it means. It's kind of difficult to understand. So that is, about that major tradition. Apart from that, there are some modern, as I was saying, there are modern so-called sects or orders in Buddhism, and one of them is, I went once to a Wonbulgyo temple. Wonbulgyo is a kind of really something developed in the last century. It's some mixture of Confucianism and Buddhism. They say that to be a monk you don't have to shave your head, you just have to be dedicated and kind of learn the teaching of a particular master who made it. They don't even put Buddha images. They say that to be a bodhisattva you just have to serve people, to help people. So it's a little bit like some influence of Christianity and Christian ideals of serving others and kind of being low but working on your inner life and something like that. It's very unusual, and you cannot even call it Buddhism in any reasonable sense, but they still call it Wonbulgyo. Won actually means circle, and Bulgyo is Buddhism, so they call it circle means complete also, so they call it complete Buddhism. Obviously, like other forms of Buddhism where you're just working on your own liberation are not complete, this is complete, and so on. So to round up, I would say that nowadays I believe Korean Buddhism is still, it's prevailing as a religion. It's like in a number, comparing the number of people who come to the temples and those who go to the churches, especially if you divide those who go to Christian churches, Protestant churches, and those who are Catholics, there are probably more Buddhists than any other. And somebody told me that as many as there are together, Protestant and Catholics, there are Buddhists, or maybe even more. Of course, some of these Buddhists are just traditionally Buddhists, and they would go to a temple maybe just once a year to celebrate Vesak. They also celebrate this the birthday of the Buddha, but then they have a separate day for Buddha's Parinibbana. They believe the Buddha's Parinibbana was in December, and that he was born in November, and so on. So,
now, as you know, how many Korean monks are there in Korea?
I heard the number of 30,000 monks.
30,000 monks.
And the number of temples, around 3,000 temples nowadays. But with the tendency to go down, that means younger generation of Koreans are less and less willing to live as monks in temples. And so they are struggling now to cover these 3,000 temples. Many of these temples that were run by Bhikkhu Sangha were given to Bhikkhunis because there are still more Bhikkhunis. And Bhikkhunis are independent in Korea. They don't have to have strong connection with Bhikkhu Sangha. They run their own business, their own temples. It's like very different than here.
So are there Samaneras and Iodine monks?
Yes. They usually make it like this. When you get as a lay person in the temple, they give you, they shave your head, they give you a brownish robe, pants and jacket, and they make you work pretty hard for about 6 months. So you just sweep and work in the kitchen and clean the many dhamma halls. They, you know, because of the climate, it's much more complicated. They have more buildings and they have heating system and all that. So these people are working hard, and they are told, you are allowed to say only 3 things. Yes, thank you, and I'm sorry. You are not allowed to argue with anybody. And when you walk through the temple, you are supposed to hold your hands like this. You cannot walk like this. And so they're really treated almost like slaves for these 6 months. So that's one of the reasons that young people don't want to become. Very few young people are ready to do these things anymore. And then after, if they survive the 6 months, then they are allowed to become summoneras. Then they are summoneras nowadays for 4 years. And during these 4 years, they are supposed to finish, how they call it? They translate it as Sutra School. Now, a Sutra School is something that only maybe about 7 or 8 temples in Korea organize. So monks come there, they all live in one room. One big room is a place where they all have to sleep, eat, study, everything. There is no privacy for these 4 years. They are even taking shower together. And during these 4 years, the older monks come and they teach them a little Vinaya, a little different Mahayana suttas and so on. And then you would expect that they know a lot about the suttas after 4 years, but I talked to some of them and they know very little about suttas. The idea that a Korean person has about learning things is you memorize, you learn by heart. So they learn quite a few things by heart, but if you ask them about the meaning of that, many of them say, oh, I don't understand. So that's how they learn. But then I asked them, so why do you have to spend 4 years there? He said, the people who did that, and some Westerners also did that, but mostly it's Korean people who do it. They say, first of all, you make a very good connection with people there. If you spend 4 years in the same room with people, you become friends for life, and we support each other until the end of life. Like we, like help each other and so on. And the second thing, you learn how to live in a community. And for Koreans, that is very important. They say that you have to learn how to understand other people without much words, and who is higher, who is lower, how to treat higher people, how to treat lower people, and things like that. They even have something that is maybe specifically Korean. They call it nunchi. Nunchi, nun is an eye, and chi means sensitivity or energy. It's like in Qigong or Tai Chi Chuan. So Qi is actually energy. So a literal meaning is energy of the eye, but it means that you learn things just by observing. So you don't need many words. You just observe, and then you know very quickly what to do, what not to do, how to talk to somebody, and things of that kind. And they believe that in these 4 years you learn that, and this is a quality that is very important for the training in Buddhism and basically in anything.
And now, how much is the percentage of Buddhist population in Korea?
But I just said that I'm not quite sure. It could be like somebody says 25%, but in my opinion, it's more than that. 25 are maybe people who really come to the temple on a regular basis. My feeling that those people who consider themselves Buddhist but come rarely or are not really very sincere Buddhists, but their families were Buddhist and they don't go to churches and so on, I think it's probably close to 40 or 50%.
But some decades ago, 80% of the Korean population Buddhist.
Yes, it's going down. The faith in modern generation Koreans is declining.
South Korea 23% now. Only 23%.
I tell you why they put it there. Because especially if the government is Christian, they would try to make these numbers lower. And they would ask people, do you go to Buddhist temple regularly? And if they say no, but they are still Buddhist, they would basically count only those who go regularly.
This is from Pew Research Center, not government. So they say 46% no religious affiliation, 23 Buddhist, and 29 Christians combined, whatever Protestant and Catholic and all that. So still Buddhists are almost same, but it's reducing basically.
Yeah, and
But-
you see, some years ago it was 80%. So
Yes,
it's getting
if you
down.
go back to 3 decades ago,
Mm-mm.
3 decades back, 80% of the Korean population Buddhist.
If you go back 100 years ago, it was 100%.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably, yes, 100%.
200 years ago, everybody was Buddhist. Everybody. So.
It was Buddhist by
By birth,
culture, yeah.
by family.
Yeah, by culture, of course, not everybody believes and practices.
Yeah.
Even in Sri Lanka, not every
Right.
Buddhist practices. They go
Yes, yes,
once a
yes.
year.
But yeah. And what is happening in Korea is that when somebody dies, at that time they become the strongest Buddhists because then
Correct.
everybody goes to the temple, they make the ceremony in the temple, they want to see the picture of that person on the altar and the monks are praying or reciting something for. So that's the time when everybody goes to.
So after they are dead, do they keep the ashes somewhere in the temple? Is there
If-
such a tradition? Because
Well-
some Mahayana temples I know that
Mahayana
they
does
keep ashes of the dead person.
I've seen that in Japan, that each temple would have a little graveyard and the monks will take care of the graves and lay people would support them for that. But in Korea, they don't do that. They have their own, for lay people, separate graveyards, but there is always a graveyard in a monastery for especially like respected monks or high monks, and they would put their ashes in the temple.
So even in America, Buddhist people, Mahayana Buddhists, they have in the Chuangyang monastery, for example, there's an entire area where they keep the ashes.
You see.
And everybody is numbered, so you know who was your ancestor. So.
But for financial reasons, that is very good for a temple because if the family keeps ashes in the temple, they are more likely to go regularly and to also support the monastery better.
And sometimes you have to pay a
Yeah,
price.
you buy that
Yeah,
space
yeah.
actually. You buy the space.
That's
I
right.
have a question. If do they have some like regular or common, let's say, ceremonies? You mentioned Vesak. So, or like in Sri Lanka, there are a number of occasions where the monks are invited to be chanting and things like that. So, they have like common practices.
Going to houses to chanting is fairly rare. Maybe in my 18 years, I think I went just a couple of times to some houses to do chanting. But people come, like monks would start their chanting at 4 o'clock every morning, and then they have a so-called morning puja or morning service and evening service at 6 o'clock. And then many people come, even at 4 o'clock, many housewives mostly come and then they bow as the chanting goes on. And monks are having usually loudspeaker. They have a chanting something like, I'll just do a little bit like, Om Chinjong Suri Suri Maha Suri Susuri Sabaha Suri Suri. And they follow with a wooden instrument. And so, then all the people who can join that, they chant together. Not just the monks, lay people join, and then it
What
becomes-
language it is? It is Korean language?
Well,
or-
it's Sino-Korean.
Korean maybe.
And some of these things are from Sanskrit, of course. Like this Suri Suri is Shri Shri, and then, So, but most of their Buddhist language comes from China, and so they are pronouncing Chinese words in a Korean way. So they call it Sino-Korean. And that's the language, just like Pali here, few people understand. In Korea, very few people understand the chanting, so they started translating that into normal Korean in the last maybe.
So the ordination and high ordination and other formal acts done in that language.
Also in that old Chinese language.
No Pali.
No part.
No,
no,
nobody
There
knows
is
Pali.
Sanskrit and Chinese basically. Chinese word translated in Chinese and then spoken in different ways. Japanese have different way, Korean have different way.
And what is considered as the golden era of Buddhism in Korea?
called?
Now we have, as example, we have Anuradhapura era,
Yeah.
Polonnaru era, like that.
There is one particular place they call Gyeongju, and that was the capital of one of these three states. And even until today, that is the strongest Buddhist area. I would think that if they look at the percentage of Buddhist population in that area is much higher than in Seoul area. Seoul is kind of modernized and so on. This is more traditional area. So when that kingdom was strong, they built many important monasteries and they had some respected monks and so on. So I think that was maybe 7th, 8th century or something like that.
Do they have Buddhist relics in these monasteries?
I think they claim that they have Buddhist relics, and they even claim to have the robe of the Buddha and things of that kind, but it's very problematic whether it's really true or just a story.
What is the ceremony called 10,000 prostrations? Night. They have like 10,000 times bowing, getting up, bowing, getting up.
It's not a particular ceremony, but they believe that it kind of purifies you if you spend the whole night chanting and doing these prostrations that are quite difficult for the body and for the knees. You have to be young and strong actually to do it.
It's practice actually.
No,
It's a practice of some sort.
now what I heard is, if you do this thing 100,000 times, your bodhisattvahood is confirmed. You are definitely a bodhisattva.
Continuously in one night, 100?
No, not one night.
All your life.
You
Yes,
cannot
all your
do
life.
it in one night. In one night, I was able to do 3,000 prostrations. But even that, you end up in the morning. You are like a few kilos lighter. I was measuring my body, and I would lose 2 or 3 kilos in one night, and you feel like totally exhausted. Somehow you feel body very tired, but mental state is very clear. Like you feel actually very happy when you finish that.
And do Korean come to India to worship sacred places?
Yeah, Bodh Gaya, all the places actually. I actually came maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago. I came with a group of Koreans and we went to Varanasi, this Isipatana and Bodh Gaya and Kushinagar. We didn't go to.
So do they accept Sakyamuni Buddha as their Buddha or any other Buddha?
Oh, yeah. No, Shakyamuni Buddha is generally considered the main Buddha, but then different sects. Some of them say that more important Buddha is Amitabha, so we should pray to him. They don't say that Shakyamuni didn't exist. They just say that Amitabha is more compassionate, and some tantric sects they have somebody called Vajra.
There are many Buddhas. There are 5 Adi Buddhas, the 5 main Buddhas. Then there is the 3 concepts of the Dhammakaya, Nirmanakaya and Sambhogakaya. So every Buddha is different and have different things.
Bhante was talking yesterday about it.
Many different variations on the theme. But they all believe in our Buddha, Lord.
And I have heard that when you're getting high ordination, you have to have a vow to become to become a bodhisattva or something like that.
Yeah, you formally take some. I mean, you recite 48 bodhisattva precepts. There is something 48 bodhisattva precepts. I don't know when was that made, but there is another kind of precept that you receive on top of your monastic precepts. And they even have a ritual of they burn your arm a little bit with something that is considered like when you take vows you should burn your arm. I met one monk without a finger, and he said when I became a monk I wrap some cloth around my finger, I put it into petroleum, into some gasoline or something, and I light it, and I was waiting until it burned completely.
This used to happen in China. They would burn their entire arm in Chang'an when Beijing was known as Chang'an, or Xi'an was known as Chang'an, sorry. They would burn their entire arm in the religious frenzy. When the relic, there is a temple near Xi'an, Fa Wan. They have a lot of relics of Lord Buddha, actually 4 sets. Only one is true, 3 are to deceive others, the attackers, and they would burn their entire arm. This is documented.
Yes, this is the Korean Buddhism.
So as you see, I should conclude, it's very different than what we have here. It's a little strange, but if you've never got out of the Korean society, as many Koreans actually didn't, then you don't know about other teaching. And then the Buddha's warning that the true Dhamma will disappear, even though we can say didn't completely disappear, for these people the true Dhamma disappeared. I mean, they don't have any understanding of what exactly was
They have only faith left, confidence left really, but everything else is gone. I think this 48 Bodhisattva vows comes from Samantabhadra, from the Avatam Sutta Sutta, most likely.
Samantabhadra's 48
Samantabhadra is the one who has the Bodhisattva vows. He takes the vows of, like one of the vows is, I will not attain enlightenment until the hells are empty. You have to wait until hells are empty. I mean, not for every Bodhisattva, but Samantabhadra is going to wait until hells are empty. So now that's never going to happen. So there will be a Bodhisattva until this eon ends. So these are the kind of vows you have. Very, very compassionate vows. Very compassionate.
But very unrealistic.
That's the thing. That's the thing.
Very compassionate.
Now about Theravada, Bodhisattva must have kindness as much as the wisdom, and he must have wisdom as much as the kindness.
They should balance each other. The two should balance the faculties.
Wisdom and compassion. Yes.
And just like wisdom and compassion,
Regarding Bodhisattvas, these two are very important.
Yes.
Now it is explained that because of the kindness, Bodhisattva come into the samsara. But because of the wisdom, he does not attach to samsara.
Okay.
Now throughout these eons, we call 4 asankhya's and etc. In this long period, Bodhisattva traveled in the samsara without attaching to samsara. But he came into the samsara because of his kindness. Otherwise, before this long period, he could have attained arahanthood.
Long time ago.
But he rejected arahanthood because of his kindness. Although he is kind, he does not. No, this is in Theravada.
Ours also.
Yes.
Mahakaruniko is the only
Yes.
epithet for Lord Buddha. He's not Mahamediko, Mahamudito, which is the other one? Upekkako. He's only Mahakarunika.
Mahakarunika.
Without that, he's not a Lord Buddha if he doesn't have that karuna.
Yes.
And that's how he does in the morning, right? The special attainment
Yes.
only available to
Mahakaruna
Buddhas.
Samapatti. Yes.
So can we say that then the Buddha, as he was coming to the last time being in the body before full parinibbana, that he was aware that he will become Buddha in this lifetime?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
He was.
He was at the day he was born. He declared that.
I am the foremost. I am
Yes,
the
he said,
eldest.
"Aggo hamasmi lokas." I become the highest
Jetto
one.
must be lokas.
Jetto hamasmi lokas.
But
Ayamanti majati nattidani
But then
punam.
wasn't it strange that he had to go to one teacher and another teacher and for 6 years struggle, and in some ways looked like, oh, is he gonna get enlightened or not? I mean, why he had to go through all these things?
Okay, although he knew that he become a Buddha, he did not know exact path until he attained middle path after the striving. And there are some other reasons that he had done some unwholesome karma in the last Buddha's time. So he has to go through these difficulties.
these are explained in the Buddha Apadana, that there are reasons he had stomach aches or headaches or Devdatta hit him. All these things are explained there.
13 unwholesome karmas gave fruits in this life to the Buddha.
And not every Buddha gets it. Only
No,
some
not every
get it.
Buddha. Yes, not every Buddha.
Not every Buddha will have this because depends on what you did before. Again, it just establishes the karma principle.
Now, for some Buddhas, even Mara does not come.
Even
Mara does not come to obstruct. Yes. So
Yeah, that's true. Or his daughters. The 3 daughters also, no?
Oh, yes. If Mara doesn't come, daughters can't come at all. Yes, now, as example, the Buddha Mangala's attainment, when Buddha Mangala, there was a Buddha called Mangala, when he attained Buddhahood, Mara just came to the, limit of the universe or something like that, and just look at and went back. Not any obstruction done.
But all the Buddhas leave behind Sutta Pitaka Vinaya Pitaka Vidhamma.
No. There are long life Buddhas. Buddha's lifespan is very long. In such a situation, they don't have lot of Sutta Vinaya Abhidhamma. No. And short lifespan Buddhas, they have Sutta Vinaya and Abhidhamma.
Well, one would expect long lifetime, there are more time to give many more suttas.
Now the thing is, at that long lifespan era, people are so wise. So Buddha need to say only few words. Don't think these things, think those things. That is enough them to attain Arahathood.
Same thing with Vinaya. Sariputra, Venerable Sariputta in one sutta asked Lord Buddha, no?
Yes.
Why don't you declare? He said, no, I know when is the time to declare. I will declare accordingly.
In long life Buddhas, they utter only 3 stanzas as Vinaya. These are the stanzas we recite every day, Sabbha Papa Sakarana, etc. So these 3 stanzas are the Vinaya. No Vinaya Pitaka.
Correct. So very different. Every Buddha is different.
No,
But certain qualities are common. They each have a wife, they each have a son, and so on and so forth.
Actually, there are 38 qualities common to all the Buddhas. 30 qualities may be common to all the Buddhas, and 8 qualities different from each other. So if you read the Buddha Vansapali and commentary to Buddha Vansapali, you find all these similarities and differences.
I have one question for tomorrow from that one.
Okay, now for the day, this much is enough, and thank you very much. We have got a lot of information, knowledge about Korean Buddhism.
I didn't expect I would be able to give a long talk. I thought
You did long talk, complete
Almost
1 hour,
1 hour.
almost 1 hour. Yes, it is very useful, and thank you very much. Much merit to you.